Welcome to CPI's webinar brief, where we look at topical news, legislation and general industry updates. Today I'm looking at deprivation of liberty, restrictive practice and human rights, with reflections on the recent Supreme Court judgment and what this means for health and social care in the UK. In June 2026, the UK Supreme Court delivered a significant judgment that changes how we think about deprivation of liberty for people who lack capacity. For over 10 years, many services have relied on the Cheshire West acid test to determine whether someone was deprived of their liberty or not. The Supreme Court has now said that this approach is far too simplistic and that professionals need to look at the person's actual lived experience, not just whether they are supervised and unable to leave. So, essentially moving from a legal checklist and towards better understanding and consideration of the person's lived experience. Historically, if a person was under continuous supervision and control and was not free to leave, they were often considered deprived of liberty if they lacked capacity and was considered a tick box approach. The Supreme Court now says this is only part of the picture. Professionals should also now be considering things like the person's wishes and feelings, whether they appear content with the arrangements, the purpose of any restrictions, the normality of their daily life, and the overall impact on the individual. More emphasis is now being placed on that person's experience and how it matters just as much as the restrictions themselves. The judgment places greater emphasis on person-centred practice. As you can see on this slide, we've got some suggested questions professionals should be asking themselves as part of the wider reflective practice piece. So thinking about what's important to this person we're supporting, asking how do they communicate their preferences to us, and do they appear comfortable and safe? Have we considered less restrictive alternatives? It's really important to stress that this isn't about removing safeguards, it's about ensuring that we understand the person behind the assessment. So here's some practical questions that we can consider that will really help you when reviewing care arrangements. Think about what choices does the person actually have and how much control do they have to exercise over those choices? What are they telling us about their own experiences and how are we evidencing their wishes and feelings? For services supporting people who may be distressed, dysregulated or at risk of harm, the judgment reinforces that many of the principles already considered best practice. The focus remains on prevention, de-escalation, positive behaviour support, trauma-informed approaches, and of course least restrictive interventions. The court here is effectively reminding us that restrictions should never become the starting point. The starting point should always be, what can this person do, rather than what do we need to stop them doing? So any restriction should always be reasonable, proportionate, in the best interest of the individual, and of course continually reviewed. This judgment doesn't remove deprivation of liberty safeguards. It doesn't remove capacity assessments, and it certainly doesn't remove the need for restrictive interventions when all other interventions have failed. What it does do is place much greater importance on human rights, wishes and feelings, choice and control, and individual experience. The question is no longer simply whether a person is supervised and unable to leave. The question now is how that person experiences their life, and what are we doing to maximise their choice, dignity, and independence? Everything we've looked at so far in today's briefing points to the same thing. Reducing restrictive practices takes a deliberate, proactive approach where restraint is only ever used as a last resort, and where safety, dignity, and best practice always remain the priority. So to help you turn that into action, I want to share a free resource that supports the focus of this session. It's a self-assessment checklist for reducing restrictive practices in a short, practical tool that you can use with your own team to assess exactly where you stand right now. This resource helps you do 4 things. Firstly, it helps you evaluate your current practices to identify your strengths and consider areas that you need to improve. Then it also helps to minimise the use of restrictive interventions whilst maintaining safety for everyone involved. Thirdly, it prevents the misuse and abuse of restraint by promoting best practices across your teams. And finally, it supports a culture of dignity and respect, both for your staff and for the people in your care. Getting your free copy is easy. You can scan the QR code on the screen or click the link in this video description and it will take you straight forward to that download. It only takes a moment, it's completely free, and it's a simple first step towards a safer, more person-centered approach. So, in summary, for this CPI webinar brief, we have 5 key principles that we've considered. 5 practical suggestions that I'd encourage every one of you to take back into your own team practice. The key takeaways here are: person-centered practice becomes even more important. Wishes and feelings must be evidenced. Number 3, the least restrictive approaches remain essential that we follow. Number 4, we talk about the idea of restrictive interventions should be reasonable and proportionate. This is a must. And finally, human rights and quality of life should be central to all of your decision making. Thank you for taking the time to view this briefing on deprivation of liberty overview from the Supreme Court judgment in June 2026. I hope you found the information useful. And if you'd like further information or help or assistance, please don't hesitate to get in touch with CPI at the details on the slide.